don't think I've ever presented to a Greek university before, even though I did my undergrad in Greece. So that's nice. So I haven't timed this. So if I go a bit overboard, please let me know. Tell me to stop. I don't want to take time from Agnes. And also, if I talk too fast or if you can't hear me well, please also let me know, because I can't really see your faces. I don't know if you're if you can hear well, or if you can understand me, and so on. Right, so the title of my presentation today is Embodying and Resisting Urban Climate Injustice, and I'll be talking more specifically, presenting you some of the outcomes of a small pilot project that we did in Raval, a neighborhood in Barcelona, speaking about intersectional vulnerabilities and radical adaptations of migrant residents. I'll be talking about heat. I'll be focusing on the aspect of heat and how this is experienced in the city, which is a question of climate injustice. So on the one hand, we have the data and the predictions that show that extreme and prolonged heat impacts the health and well-being of people. We very well know this in Southern Europe. We have felt it in our skins. We've had more than 61,000 heat attributable deaths in Europe in 2022 from the heat waves of 2022. And heat-related mortality could double within the next 34 years is the prediction. Here I show you some graphs from the latest Lancet Climate and Health report that came out a couple of days ago, which show first that the graph on the top, which shows kind of like a clock, or the 24-hour clock, shows the times of the day when heat is a potential threat to human health has expanded across Europe, not only in Southern Europe. And the maps show that the mortality rates, the death rates from heat waves have also increased, especially for women, the second map, and are expected to increase even more in the coming years, which is the last map there. So it's not looking very good. The impacts of heat can be direct, like heat strokes and exhaustion and even death, but also indirect by destabilizing ecosystem functions and causing the spread of infectious diseases, or causing more frequent and catastrophic forest fires, but also impacting everyday life, impacting the choices we make in our everyday life, how we go about with our everyday tasks. It impacts occupational health, the health of people at work, but also the capacity to perform care work. Now, we need to understand health vulnerability as an expression and consequence of historical and ongoing oppressions. We know, and it has been documented from past heat waves, that things like social isolation and social marginalization are factors defining heat vulnerability, as well as things like outdated and non-resilient housing, the lack of neighborhood infrastructures like green areas and parks, and other types of amenities that can protect from heat also increase heat vulnerability. And these kinds of things are mostly seen in neighborhoods or areas that have been segregated and where Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities are mostly inhabiting. And these studies come mostly from the US, but I think that this can be also said for many places in Europe about segregated neighborhoods and low-income people, but also migrant communities. And on top of this, neoliberal trends in urban and health governance have contributed to the increased vulnerability of some of the most marginalized, let's say, collectives. So in this work that I'll be presenting today, I'm focusing on migrants, and I'm focusing on migrants from the majority world, or so-called global south, because they represent some of the most heat vulnerable people. They represent some of the most heat vulnerable people because of systemic and ongoing and everyday forms of discrimination and violence that they experience, both during and after their migration journeys, and which shape the negative outcomes of health and well-being. So migrants are often minoritized, they're racialized in places of migration destination, such as in European cities. And we can say that they embody the consequences of historical dispossessions linked to colonial and racial oppressions, which have forced large part of the majority world countries into debt, conflict, or poverty. Some of the recent studies have shown that migrants globally are more likely to suffer negative health impacts from heat. Also, recent studies have come out to make the point that it is racism and climate change that interact and have disproportionate effects on the lives of minoritized people, both between countries and both within countries and between the global north and south. These inequities are seen in health. And even though things like the local community is important, locally informed adaptation is a slogan that we hear a lot. Who is part of this local community is not so much interrogated, especially when we're thinking of migrants. Migrants are rarely seen as members of the climate concerned or climate knowledgeable local communities that can inform adaptation. And so the argument I'm making is that we need an intersectional urban climate justice approach to address this, to look at it, to question it, and to address it. So intersectionality comes from feminist theory, and I'm here drawing from feminist political ecology, environmental and climate justice studies. And I'm looking at climate-related and heat-specific vulnerability and adaptation as historically contingent, right? As very tied to historical processes, uneven and deeply political. And political all the way through, meaning both in terms of the distribution of the negative or positive impacts, but also in epistemological terms, right? Related to how climate change impacts and adaptation, how are they framed? How are they understood? Who has a say in this? And consequently, what types of responses are considered adequate and whose interests are represented in these types of debates. So the interrogation of this type of injustice then, both distributional but also epistemological or procedural, we can say, or representational, should be through intersectional ways in which it is rendered, right? So it has to encompass not only class, gender, age, but also aspects of ethnicity, religion, country of origin, race, and citizenship status, also in Europe, because this is mostly done, but not so much in Europe, right? We don't talk so much about these aspects or these axes of power and oppression in European cities, at least when we're talking about adaptation and climate. So this deeper understanding of vulnerability as a result of deeper structural drivers such as poverty or labor exploitation or social marginalization or racism, this deeper understanding of vulnerability beyond just the exposure to a thing like heat or a flood or whatever, is an important step towards heat or climate justice. And in order to do this, we need to understand how this works through integrating place-based and experiential knowledges. And this is where my project is also begin. So what I'm presenting today is kind of a pilot of a bigger project, like Yorgos mentioned, that will start in September. And actually, we're going to have a case study in Athens. So I'd be interested to know who is working on relevant or similar issues and link up. The question that drives this project is this: what shapes vulnerability to heat-related health impacts, and what knowledges and practices are being mobilized by migrant collectives to confront extreme heat and its negative impacts? So this project, the main kind of theoretical underpinning of this has been published in a chapter that I wrote as part of this book, Urban Movements and Climate Change. And where I explain why focusing on climate-related vulnerabilities that follow migration, not just what happens before one migrates, right? Because usually these kinds of questions are asked about the climate and migration question is usually asked in terms of how is climate a push factor for migration, you know, and climate refugees and all that discourse. But what I'm trying to see here is what happens after people migrate, how are they impacted by climate then, and what do they do about it, can provide insight on who forms part of the population of concern. So like Judith Butler said, in climate urbanism. Right, so speaking about migrants, it's inevitable to speak about margins and marginalization. And inspired by some feminist writings of Bell Hooks, Anna Ching, and others, I propose that we must look at the margin that migrants often occupy, both the spatial and the social margins that they find themselves in terms of vulnerability and adaptation, and look at it, conceive of it not as a static or unchangeable thing, not even as single-faceted, but rather as places where exclusion and empowerment are in conversation, where vulnerability is both inhabited and confronted. And this is the reason why, I look at them in conversation. The hypothesis or the starting point is that migrants have valuable knowledge about both their vulnerability and about the best way to adapt, not just in an individual manner, but also collectively and at a bigger scale as well. So turning now to the research that we've done in Barcelona on this topic in Raval. This was a collaboration between myself and other researchers from the Barcelona Lab of Urban Sustainability and Justice, as well as from Universitat de Alcalá in Madrid. Very quickly, a bit of context about Raval. This is a neighborhood which has embodied a notion of marginality and stigma since the 18th century. In the 1920s, it was coined as Barrio Chino, which translates as Chinatown of Barcelona, although there were no Chinese people living there at that time. But it was a name that it was given to signify, the marginal, unlawful activities that were taking place there. A framing that, in the case of Raval as well as elsewhere in the world, serves for staging kind of the performance of marginal identities. A recent report shows that Raval is, well, before that, maybe I'll show you this. So Raval has about 40% residents coming from global south countries, one of the highest percentages in Barcelona. It has high density. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's right here. This little square here is Raval. It has high density and old building stock built before the 60s with very poor thermal performance, and that matters when we're talking about heat and cold. And it experienced the highest number of tropical nights in the city in 2022, 120 nights. That's 3 months of tropical nights, meaning the temperature didn't drop below 25 degrees. And this is a map that shows its elevated vulnerability in terms of heat-attributed mortality risk that was done by Mari del Olmo and colleagues. And this is a more recent one that shows, again, it shows vulnerabilities calculated in a different way, but basically it shows that it's one of the most, and here I have it circled, one of the most climate vulnerable neighborhoods. This is partly, or this has been combined to calculate this disposable income, again, one of the lowest in the city, life expectancy, and here are the green spaces where Raval you see is one of the whitest, meaning one with the least percentage of green space per resident. Sorry, let me just take this out of the way. All right, so what did we do in Raval? We used photo voice, which is a participatory photography method. Basically, we gave people cameras or we gave them phones, and we asked them to take pictures of what heat waves means to them. What are the aspects of life that make them more or less comfortable during days of extreme heat and nights? And then we came together and we discussed those, and we had 5 sessions with 10 participants, 7 women and 3 men, 7 from Latin America, 2 from Morocco, 1 from Nigeria. And it's important to note that most of these people we engaged with were members of the ICTA-UAB, it's like a renters union in the Raval. And we complemented this with 2 interviews with representatives of 2 large migrant communities in Barcelona, namely the Pakistani and the Bolivian community. So some of the findings quickly, if I have time. Right, so one of the first things, and it's not really very surprising, but I think it's worth, and these are the pictures that you will be looking now, is some of the pictures that they took actually. So one of the first things that became crystal clear from the beginning was that labor precarity and housing precarity act as very strong determinants of urban heat vulnerability and injustice. And this is important to understand with a context in Raval, because Raval, as part of Ciutat Vella, the wider district, has some of the highest rates of energy poverty in the city, where the most disadvantaged groups are living in flats that are not well insulated, like I said, or energy efficient. So it's very hard to cool those places down, and it's very hard also to heat them because people can't afford to run a fan or an air condition if there is one in. Most people are renting, and they have experienced significant increases in rent during recent decades because, if you don't know, Barcelona has been going through a massive wave of gentrification and touristification in the last couple of decades, especially the central districts of Barcelona. But apart from that, migrants also face discriminatory attitudes from homeowners and real estate companies when they're looking to rent a flat. So, for example, a study that took place in 2015 showed that from 460 phone calls to real estate agencies, 70% would deny the availability of flats for rent to people with an immigrant background. And on the other hand, rental contracts here often require a formal employment and residence document, which obviously is very challenging for a lot of migrants to have. So home insecurity and precarity forces people into homes which become inhabitable during heat waves. And I have some quotes here from people about how they described, some of these things. I'll let you read them while I collect my thoughts here. One of the participants in the project told us it was a woman from Morocco. My house is hell, it's very bad. For me, it's the worst part. So, the home, which is supposed to be a shelter, is supposed to be a safe place, a place where you want to go to in the times of the heat wave, becomes really a place you don't want to be in. And that was pretty shocking to hear. The same kind of challenges in terms of labor precarity. This is a quote from a woman who works as a cleaner in buildings and in homes. And she says that, when she works during the summer, I get out of there dripping sweat. There's no ventilation. The stairs have no windows. When I asked to go earlier to clean to avoid the heat, they told me that it's not possible because they work from home. And so I go when they go out for lunch, basically the hottest time of the day. And what she says is very key here. Who can I complain to? Who can we complain to when there is no contract? The same situation one can imagine is the case for other types of workers, delivery workers, for example, construction workers, people working in restaurants or other types of businesses where they're not formally employed or they don't have official documents, so they are denied the right to complain in that sense. So when the house becomes inhospitable, where do you go? You go outside and you try to find shelter. The second kind of set of findings showed that even that kind of public space of heat relief becomes inaccessible for many of those collectives. Places like shaded parks and playgrounds or pools, public pools or air-conditioned spaces like libraries, not only are they scarce, but present accessibility challenges. Public green space, for example, apart from the fact that Raval has very few of it, is often used as terraces, as a place for bars and restaurants to put their chairs, turning them into semi-privatized, I would say, spaces where to be there you need to consume. And in combination with the fact that the neighborhood is heavily touristified and gentrified, the prices of those bars and restaurants are not normal prices. They're very overpriced. So people say, things as basic as eating out is turning into a luxury. Having a refreshment in a bar becomes impossible in your own neighborhood. So, and other people talk about public pools, which, by the way, in Barcelona are some of the most expensive ones in the country. I don't know why. They say, why should we pay the same price as a tourist to access the public pool, which we have paid through our taxes? Now, another interesting thing is that the city of Barcelona, so a parenthesis here, we've had a pretty progressive government of Barcelona en Comú between 2016 and 2023, not anymore. They had prioritized climate action, they had feminism as a banner, they had social justice as a banner, and so on. And what they did, a key policy that they put forward was a network of indoors and outdoors climate shelters, publicly accessible spaces, like libraries, parks, civil centers, etc. However, People in Raval, which is again, it's a grand majority of migrants living there, they didn't even know about this network. They didn't know it and they didn't use it. And at least up until 2023, when we did this research, and I don't know if things have changed much, but so they were largely unaware of this network as such. Like it wouldn't come to their mind that they would go to a library when it's very hot. Some stress that many of these spaces are partially or completely closed for the month of August, like any other public administration in Barcelona, when they're mostly needed. But also, they said things like this. So talking about, for example, elderly Pakistani men, the first quote, it's difficult for them to open, no, sorry, that's the second quote. They usually will not go. They know there is an elderly home in the neighborhood, which acts as a climate shelter, but normally they stay out of it because they're always in groups of many. And when they talk a lot with each other, they feel that they annoy other people who usually just come on their own. So a bit like a sort of a cultural restriction that they feel that makes the place unfamiliar or not so welcome for them. Interestingly enough, these other dots that are blue here represent unofficial climate shelters. So these are shelters that an organization that brings together about 50 social organizations, educational centers, cultural institutions. It's called Tot Raval. It's like a foundation. They have started setting up their own kind of more bottom-up climate shelters, and this started last year. And they told us that they're very much used and populated by everybody that lives in the neighborhood. So we see the official and unofficial kind of climate shelters. It's interesting the fact that the unofficial ones have more, let's say, use, or they're more I don't know, known by the residents. The third set of findings, and I think it's the most interesting one, is that so we said that, you know, there's rare green spaces that is really public, and that and rare cooling spaces that are really accessible. So residents of Raval have created their own. Apart from this network of bottom-up shelters that I said, the participants of this research really describe two spaces in the neighborhood as very key for them. They're two community-run spaces that operate as places of neighborhood connection and resistance. And they're tied to broader social justice struggles for housing, for gender and LGBTQI+ rights, for migrant rights. One is an occupied squatted communal garden called Agora, Juan Andrés Benitez, and the other one is an ex-art school, a building, which is now a multifaceted center accommodating a diverse set of initiatives, including the housing union, the labor union, a food network, a popular school, a popular gym, and many others. It's called Antiga Masana. So this is what people said to us. We're lucky to have those spaces because we can have a space to do different activities, to keep fresh, and this is work that in the end we put in and we do for ourselves. Conviviality, sharing of resources, sharing of caring duties, sharing stories, all contributed to a feeling of withstanding the heat together. And other activities that they did there, you know, included open air cinemas, gardening, workshops, summer school for kids that could not access the official summer camps, and so on. So some thoughts before I close. Turning a little bit back to theory, and what this work opened to me is this question of how we can look at everyday resistance and social infrastructures like the two ones that I mentioned as radical urban climate adaptations. Moving away from ideas of, you know, like I said before, away from this individualized notion of I have to adapt, so I have to do things to adapt myself, you know, becoming resilient while everything else remains the same. We see radical adaptations in the plural as a collection of practices and knowledges that may also include informal work, informal care work, social relations, daily life processes through which spaces and places are redefined by people in ways that shape their exposure, but also their experience and impacts and the related impacts to climate change. They are considered radical because they collectively challenge and resist the root causes of vulnerability, both at structural, systemic, and everyday local level. So this kind of everyday radical adaptations can also include the resistance to the mainstream climate adaptation initiatives. It can include small incremental changes in our daily lives, but it can also include collective practices and making of places as refuges of collaborative survival in the face of climate change. So some concluding thoughts, not to take too much time. I think that, first of all, moving away from this dualistic framing of vulnerability versus resilience or vulnerability versus adaptation, we can better understand how both adaptive and maladaptive practices, both agency and powerlessness and resistance play out in people's everyday experiences of heat or other types of climate impacts. We can look at margins as productive grounds where vulnerability is not only inhabited or experienced, but also confronted. And by asking, these questions of like, how do different forms of living and relating can question dominant paradigms of what is climate urbanism or what does it look like? And this kind of questions, what these kinds of questions can open is a sort of an agency coming from the margins, this generative potentiality, right, that can inform radical and just climate adaptations in the city. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.